Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is.
Shannon Sandford from Griffith University.
Thank you so much for being here today, Prof. Sanford. And you've already confided in me that you're in your childhood home, and that must have all kinds of emotional resonance. But you've also confirmed that you are working like a beaver,
Yeah.
constructing
Yeah.
dams and all kinds of things, right? So I wonder if you
Yes.
could inquire, Prof. Sanford, as to what's currently preoccupying, impeding, dynamizing, interesting you. What's going on?
Mm. A really good opening question. I feel like I could go in two directions here in terms of
Mhm.
something that's interesting me, always interesting me, but particularly now, and something that is also impeding me in terms of my work. So it's sort of
Okay.
a love-hate relationship that I have. But I've been thinking a lot, because here in Australia, it's the beginning of school. It's back to school. So we have a different kind of timetable for primary and high school students. And yesterday was their first day. And so
Ah,
all of my family and my friends were posting about their children going off. And I don't have children of my own, but I have many sort of like friends with young children. So I think of them as kind of my nieces and nephews.
yes.
And I think a lot about their school and about their reading. And the reason this is also an interesting and an impeding thing to me is because at this time of year, I'm also thinking about what I will set as reading for my students in the
Ah,
university who are about to start soon. And I'm a teaching focused academic. So that basically means that 70% of my time is teaching and there's a smaller proportion for research now. And so that's always a little bit impeding to me in terms of the work that I want to do and the writing I want to do and then what I need to do. So I've been thinking about what I'll set and what my students will want to read because there's a sort of, I'm noticing a sort of hesitance now around being able to set long text. So being able to set novels. And actually, a colleague once sort of remarked to me that like I can't set too many novels in a reading list because students just won't read them. And that was disheartening, but also maybe um, true in terms of a broader sort of reading culture being observed across schools and in my university. And so I was thinking about what will I set that they'll read, um, and what I'll show them that will get them into reading, I suppose, or get them enthusiastic about reading. And I don't know, I'm always just struck by this idea of what's considered easy reading, and therefore quicker reading, and therefore my students will read them, and therefore we can have the chats we want to have. And sometimes what comes up in that is, well, you should set short text, you should set comics, you should set, things with images, things that are digital, things, all these different kinds of text. So I don't know. That's a long, rambling story, but I've just been thinking a lot about reading and how to get my students to read when there's sort of this moral panic constantly always and circulating around again about people don't read. And not to bring it back to my research so quickly, but I do feel like sometimes comics they get sort of labeled with that, well, these are easy texts. And so you should set them because they're a way in. And I've got certain feelings about that.
well,
So yeah.
can I go back to what you said about you're only having 30% of your time available for research? This
Hmm.
amazes me, given how productive you are.
Oh, that's nice of you to say. Um, yeah, I don't know if I've been that productive lately. I think I've just been fortunate enough that things have come out in a way that makes me look very productive.
This can be one of the
But
ironies of life. Yes.
yeah,
The date on the tin doesn't really tell you what's inside.
yes. Yeah, so a lot of my time now is sort of um, thinking a lot more about teaching, but also trying to think about how I can. um, find those little lovely moments to do my
Mm,
research
mm.
and to write the things that I want to write and feel engaged in that space again when sometimes I don't always.
And getting on to this question of young people and reading, I was actually talking to a faculty member at the Universidad de Guadalajara today, which is a huge public university, hundreds of thousands of students and so on. And she can't get students to read anything at all. Something she attributes in part to COVID-19 and young people who in high school or in college have had much of that early adulthood despoiled in ways that one is only coming to terms with now. I wonder whether that resonates with you at all.
It does. And like I'm hesitant to, put things down to, one kind of factor. I think there's lots of things at play here, but I do think that COVID maybe had a larger impact on younger people in terms of their, I suppose, how they're encultured into art, into reading
Mm.
than we realize. Because, I mean, on the one hand, you could say, well, reading is a solitary activity. And so, how is that impacted by spending a lot of months kind of in our homes? But on the other hand, I think reading is also can be really based in community in terms of book clubs, in terms of, you know, young people meeting in a public sphere, in libraries, in that kind of sense, that has been really impacted. And so I feel like the sort of run on has been maybe a lack of interest or a lack of seeing reading as a hobby, seeing reading as something to do. Um, that's not a chore. A lot of my
Mm.
students sort of express that, I don't have the time to read. Um, and I think that's always a curious statement because I find I read in my downtime right before bed, and so that's my time. Um, Whereas they think of it as I need to find a day. I need to find a spare 10 hours to read this whole novel at once before class. And I don't
Oh,
have the time for
wow.
that,
Wow.
which is very interesting to me because I feel like that says something about maybe reading's maybe lost a space in terms of being part of one's personal life. Now it's work,
Mm.
whereas I don't really feel like I have ever felt that way about it. But I do think that COVID has some part to play in this. And maybe also other things like, social media, TikTok, sort of short form
Mm.
entertainment, all those things I'm
Mm.
sure also play a role.
Mm. Mm. I have two daughters, one of whom is grown up, one of whom is 10. The
Mhm.
10-year-old reads probably a book a week, and they're big physical books that are YA
Mm.
fiction. But she likes YA
Right.
fiction, young adult fiction. And I asked her how she finds out about this stuff. Like, where are the reviews? How does she know? Her friends don't read books. Pinterest is the answer.
Oh.
She's given up on TikTok. I thought Pinterest was clothes and makeup, but apparently it's rife with, I recommend this trilogy.
Oh, yeah, that's true. That's true. I had a student once tell me that they get all their recommendations from Reddit,
Ah,
from
right.
the sorts
Yes.
of book
Okay.
communities where can you
Yeah.
recommend this book, that
Right.
book. So I feel like there's some interesting kind of like overlap there in terms of like um digital platforms being new space where you can sort of find books and find the things that you like.
Well, quite. I mean, for
Um,
years, recipe books have been the best sellers in most countries. And often recipe books, when they're written by famous chefs, are actually really not that different from compilations of photographs on Instagram of what you and your aunt ordered at dinner. Anyway, Prof, you mentioned so-called easy reading,
Mm,
and you talked about comics and so on. This is part of your research, as is,
mm,
you know, the world of graphic
hmm
narrative, web comics. Could you tell us a wee bit about those genres?
Yeah. I think the best way to kind of, I mean, there's lots of debate about what constitutes what in terms of form, and I'm not always interested in those kinds of technicalities. But at a basic kind of level, I would say um, graphic narratives are maybe something we would connect with, like a more, it's been a term that's been used to describe kind of more prestigious, if I can use that word, graphic novels, right? Things that feel like, hardcover, weighty, or at least something like book length. And the reason I say, prestigious with, and people can't see this, but with like some air quotes, um, is because I think that that term is a little bit of a problem in terms of, what it's sort of designating one group of texts as more worthy than others.
Yeah.
Um, that's the way that it's been used. Um, and comics, I suppose, would be a better term for the medium. So if you think about the ways that these texts work, you have a series of um, panels or frames, and in between them, you have a little bit of space. So you might have like a 4x4. It's difficult to describe a visual medium in a sort of audio format, but that's what I would describe as comics is those kinds of sequential, or not always sequential, but those kinds of arrangements of panels and frames
Yeah.
with the little space in between. And then webcomics, I think of them as texts that are maybe made to be online, made to be published or sometimes produced online, circulated online.
Mm.
We see them most predominantly on social media. You'll see a lot of sort of Instagram comics artists, which is kind of the space that I'm really interested in at the moment and throughout my PhD. And I'm coming back to it now because I'm making my PhD thesis into a book.
Oh,
Um,
congratulations. That's exciting.
oh, thank you. I mean, it's a rewarding and also um, deeply humbling experience when I go back to what I was writing at that time and think, oh my gosh. So yeah, that's been a really great project. But yeah, so I'm thinking about I guess what's core to all of those forms is this idea of text and image working together, and not necessarily, you know, I think not necessarily in sort of a picture book way where, there's an image that's illustrating the text. That's not
Mm.
quite what's happening in comics. I think something more is going on. Um, but that interplay of those two um, kinds of narratives
Mm.
is really interesting to me and actually what I think makes comics really complex, whereas, you know, there's sort of a tendency to view them as, well, they're just a grown-up's picture book, and so therefore they're a really nice way to get kids to read because they've just been reading picture books and now they can read these more sophisticated things. And that line of thinking is not, it's not necessarily, I think, correct. It sort of gets my goat when people say that because I feel it reduces something about um, the sort of intricacies of telling a story in images and in words
Mm.
at the same time.
Yes, and when they're separated, people are happier, aren't they? People are
Yes.
happier if it's art and happier if it's literature. So, what do you do when people say, how is anybody ever going to read Jane Austen, for example,
Oh,
or Jack
yeah.
Davis, if this is the world that we're in? And by the
Yeah.
world we're in, I don't mean the whole world, I mean the world of studying literature, in inverted commas, or studying English or whatever. Do you see what I'm getting at? What's the answer to
Mm,
that sort of aesthetic hierarchy that will be more interested in a proto-feminist writer of the 19th century or an indigenous writer of the 20th?
mm. I don't know if I have. That's a hard question. I don't know if I have the sort of silver bullet to that. I would say though that I mean I'm sort of going on about how, my students don't read. There are a large number of my students that love Jane Austen. So I don't want to, from the bat, I don't want to be generalizing too much here.
Okay, okay,
Um,
understood. Yeah.
I think, at least in my view, and I can only really speak for myself,
Mm,
I
mm,
think part of the job that we have as well, I'm a literary studies scholar. Um, that's what I'm employed to do,
yeah.
is lecture in literary studies. And I think part of our job is to um, introduce students to these texts, whether they like it or not, to be honest. I don't necessarily think that students should always read what they relate to most. And that's generally an answer I get about from young people is I'm not interested in that because it doesn't relate to me.
Sorry,
And I always
I need to pause, Prof. We're back recording, folks. Apologies for cutting in on what the Prof was saying. And you were indicating to us that actually there are lots of, what are they called? Austenians, Jane Austen readers amongst your students, and it would be wrong to think that they're only doing, in inverted commas, easily accessible readings. And you were also saying that you've got a certain job as a person in literary studies, I think.
Mhm.
And that's presumably not things like the great tradition. It's not conventional aesthetic hierarchies. Or is that still important? Is judgment something that people learn by reviewing texts?
Yeah, I think there's certainly room in literary studies to introduce our students to a broader range of authors and texts, and we should,
Yeah.
right? I'm not, that's part of what I strive to do when I'm setting readings is thinking about the moment,
Yeah.
thinking about what my students are engaged with, but also recognizing that some of those ideas are captured in classic works already, speaking to, for instance, the environment or speaking to um, gender or identity. Those things exist in different ways in sort of classic texts. And so I suppose I'm not interested in setting texts with the goal of, well, I want to push my students to read, 500, 600 pages across the semester because I think that will help them become a better reader. I don't think that will. But I do think there's probably space to show them how certain texts can be relevant to their lives now, relevant to the moment that we're in. And on the other hand, I suppose broadening their horizons in terms of the kinds of authors that they might know or be introduced to,
Mm.
and helping them realize, those those kinds of authors that maybe don't get recognition or don't get, they're not often set in schools or on the curriculum. And so I think that's kind of our role is, and also to show students, the kinds of, I suppose, um, the kind of benefits of reading in a kind of like, in terms of being able to um, cultivate empathy and understanding and um, understand certain different characters, people that, are written outside of your own experience. I think that's also very important.
Mm.
And so there's lots of kind of areas that we're trying to cover here for our students. And sometimes we're successful and sometimes we're not. But I think the goal is to um, bring students with us into those kinds of conversations about books and spaces where reading is highlighted as something that's ultimately, I think, a social good.
And that brings me on to asking you about some themes you've written about, both academically and in the more public arena. And one of those is something you've already touched on en passant, which is gender. So
Mm.
some of your work engages that. Could you share with us a wee bit about that aspect of your research?
Yeah, I think what I'm interested in, and I'm most of my research concerns like graphic life narratives. So I'm interested in comics,
Mhm.
what comics form brings to narrating lived experience or narrating lives, autobiography, nonfiction. Um, and so I'm interested in, um, well, very recently in comics as a way to represent um, gendered or sexual violence in particular. So I'm thinking about it in the context of hashtag MeToo and what kinds of true stories can be told through comics that maybe is not possible in a sort of testimonial form, and what that might offer survivors in terms of being able to share a story without, fear of retribution. Or here in Australia, we have quite strict defamation laws, and so that's a real impediment to people's ability to speak and also be heard, particularly be heard as authoritative of their own experience.
Yeah.
Often, there's a sort of troubling, um, I don't want to say trend, but there's sort of a troubling aspect to sharing an experience like that, is that you're not believed as a survivor. And so I'm interested in the intervention that comics or a graphic life narrative can make in terms of being able to represent an experience that is
Mm.
um, difficult and traumatic. Um, yeah, what kinds of expression does it make possible is
And
kind of where my research is right now.
Me Too was very dramatic in its effects over the last, I guess, 10 years, but
Mm.
picking up on concerns really across history, but especially in the context of feminism. What was its incarnation like in Australia, or is its incarnation in Australia? Because it's been criticized and dropped away in some of its effect in many countries because of particularly unpleasant forms of hegemonic masculinity attacking it. The advent of a very traditional form of femininity in the shape of trad wife and so on, and also on the grounds of racial difference and so on. So, where would you say it is now in the Australian context?
Mm. I think I think we've probably moved into a space of, I don't want to say we're not beyond hashtag Me Too.
Mhm.
I think we are in a space of greater acknowledgement of the kinds of structural inequalities that are faced by different kinds of people, women, non-binary, trans people in particular, although not
Mhm.
always, but especially.
Mhm.
Um, and the ways that those structures affect those people differently. And I think in Australia, what has been, it's been maybe less of a reckoning or less of a kind of, um, it's been less of a kind of calling out of perpetrators in the public sphere because um, there is a kind of, I guess, there's a real risk to survivors who speak. And
Mhm.
that's not to say that's only in Australia, but it was certainly a different kind of movement than what we observed in the US.
Mm.
And that felt a little bit like calling public figures to account in terms of celebrities and certain kinds of, influential people. And here there was a little bit of that, but not with the same kinds of consequences. Um, and that might be kind of a product of our judicial system.
Mm.
And also, I think, you know, there's it's difficult to kind of speculate on this because I'm trying not to, um, focus this down into one kind of absolute.
No,
But
understood. But I guess what you're talking about is certain, I think, certain pressures that may have
mm,
pushed people into quasi-fictional incarnations of their survival, rather than saying X did Y to me on the following date. Yeah? Is that part of it?
yeah, and I think that's where I think that the sort of testimonial or sort of life narrative.
Oh, Prof, you're silenced.
Oh,
Ah, you're back now.
okay, thanks. Sorry.
Yes, this is the woman silenced, just as she's talking about hashtag me too.
Yes, well, such a um what a yeah, unfortunate timing. But yeah, so sorry, going on to what I was saying about, I think
Yeah.
there's a role here for life narrative to be the space where you can share those kinds of experiences without the kinds of harsh or retribution
Mm.
that a lot of survivors face. And I feel like that, what you described before as sort of fictionalizing, I think that comes to the fore in interesting ways in comics because it is a form that is a sort of a space where people can or artists can, visualize an experience in a way that might be ambiguous or might be, metaphorical.
Mm.
And in that, I still think there is an element of a real experience and there's a kind of stark truth in it, but it's just represented in a way that allows for a broader range of, you know, um, yeah, representation of what happens. And so I'm interested in how those kinds of features of comics are used to tell that story.
And could you tell us a little bit about life writing or life narrative more generally?
Yeah. It's a field that I feel like is growing, especially here in Australia. Um, as a sort of, I guess, as a genre or as a form, it's really a space that's interested in how people tell stories about their own lives and the lives of other people, and who gets to speak or who gets to tell a life story and who maybe doesn't,
Hmm.
and the kinds of tensions and ethics and possibilities bound up in telling a life or a lived experience. So, within that, of course, it's quite a generative area. Comics is made, or graphic life narrative is one tiny corner. But it's also interested in kind of more, things like social media, things like how you curate or construct an identity online. Um, Biography and autobiography and memoir are sort of, foundational to the form as well. But there's also things like autofiction, which um, is really a space where, the nonfiction and the fiction is kind of coming together in interesting ways. Um, or auto-theoretical in terms of bringing the personal to theory. So there's sort of an array of different kinds of modes captured within
Mm.
this genre. And I feel like, um, at least in Australia, there's sometimes a divide between literature and nonfiction. And I feel like that is maybe breaking down a little bit in terms of thinking of nonfiction as literature. as something that's, you know, sophisticated, and it's not just, a recounting of a life as such. It's sometimes something that's evocative and appealing
Mm.
as well.
And getting on to some of the other complex social issues and political ones that you've engaged with in terms of your writings that I've been able to get hold of, you've also addressed mental health
Mhm.
issues. And I wondered if you could tell us a wee bit about that.
Yeah, I'm very interested in, although I haven't published on it in a couple of years, I want to return to it, particularly
Okay.
in the book that I'm
Mhm.
writing, in graphic medicine and in the kind of intersection between comics and healthcare, and how
Mm,
comics is maybe a way to express something like um, chronic illness or depression, anxiety, the so-called, like invisible illnesses, and how it might provide a language to present something internal, something that's not obviously observable in a person's physicality. And so I suppose, the work that I've done in that area is focused on depression. In terms of, there's really wonderful graphic texts, graphic narratives about chronic depression, and about sort of, if you think about almost representing visually some kind of internal, maybe dialogue with yourself in terms of, the kinds of things that you say to yourself in that state, and
mm,
how that can be presented in different ways
mhm.
through comics. And I feel like that's a space that is really, I sort of gone gangbusters recently, because there's so many people who feel validated by that kind of expression, or feel like you've represented exactly how I feel and I don't know how to express. And so
That's-
there's a place there.
I'm really shocked at the current debate in Britain where doctors are being attacked because increasingly they are identifying young people as suffering in terms of mental health and hence
Mm,
eligible for inverted commas benefits, when it's quite clear that this extraordinary rise in depression and other such
mm,
conditions amongst young people is over the last 5 years when, unemployment is rising, the economy is not good, and this COVID-19 issue is there. And instead, we're being told that these are just skivers who don't want to work, don't want to study, and all the rest of it, right? And that they
yeah.
are hoodwinking these vulnerable, silly liberal doctors. Um,
Yeah, funny how that happens when, everything is so unstable, but it's the youth that are the problem, or it's people, gaming the system that
yeah.
are the problem, when actually I feel like those kinds of structures are collapsing around us, giving people, there's good reason why people are suffering. And so that should really be validated rather than dismissed.
Another important issue that you've addressed is refugees
Hmm.
and the historic ambivalence towards refugees in so many immigrant societies, as opposed to voluntary migrants or people who are deemed to be truly of the nation, as it were.
Mm.
I wonder if you could talk to us about that, about the work you've done on refugees.
Yeah. I mean, there's a bit of context to lay out here in terms of, obviously I'm speaking to you from Australia. Um, and in Australia, we have quite a, I would say, we have like a history of some pretty abhorrent and atrocious kind of treatment of um, refugees and also asylum seekers, um, in terms of, you know, um, housing them on Manor Island or in offshore detention centers. And there's a kind of cloak of invisibility around that in terms of no one quite knows what's going on, or in the past has quite known what's going on in those spaces and how people have been treated. And so I feel like part of what the work that I'm interested in is how the writing or the texts that kind of come from the people in those communities, so refugees and asylum seekers particularly, how that kind of offers a way for the Australian public, the broader public, to understand that experience. Because there was a time when journalists were not allowed to report from offshore detention centres. They were closed, and so there really was a sense of, there's some evil going on here, but we don't have access to. And so the kinds of stories to come from that are so powerful and so tragic, but
Mm.
also revealing of the kind of state mandated practices that were going on there. And that's still going on, by the way, in terms of, Australia's closed some offshore detention centers, but we still have this sense of there's a real kind of, there's a certain kind of attitude towards people that come to Australia by boat in particular. Um, And so, yeah, so my work in that area, my interest in that area is really, again, the kinds of testimony that graphic narratives can unveil here, and how their treatment of trauma and of memory and of that kind of traumatic experience, um, opens up a way for people to understand, but also for refugees and asylum seekers themselves to represent that experience.
Mhm. And so
So
some of the texts that you analyze produced by people who are either in these offshore centers or were in them.
yeah, yes. um, were in them, but not necessarily settled in Australia later. And then some of them are also people who visit. And so there's one text in particular. It's a webcomic called Villawood, but it's since been made into a print graphic narrative called Still Alive by Safdar Ahmed. Um, which is a kind of telling of a collective experience. So the way that it was made was by interviewing a range of different people in detention, in Sydney's Villawood Detention Centre, which is onshore, but in a kind of excise migration zone, so not quite um, bound by the same kinds of, I guess, laws of Australia. Um, and so, yeah, so those people that were interned there um, illustrated some of their history, some of their experiences,
Mm.
and then the artist himself um, embedded this in a kind of larger graphic narrative about that place and about Australia's general kind of abhorrence or um, towards refugees and asylum seekers. And so that's a really interesting text in terms of the collaboration there between the artist and the subjects
Yes.
or the people that were interned there.
And another topic that you mentioned briefly earlier that you've published on as part of a collective endeavor is the environment, where there's a collective of quite a few of you engaged in, it says, creative writing or the teaching thereof, right? And how this can be a means of entering into what looks like quite profound dialogue over our climate crisis. So, what's up with that stuff?
Yeah, that was a lovely project that I worked on actually as an RA, like as a research assistant when I was in my PhD. And so it's a collective that's based at the University of South Australia, or what was the University of South Australia, um, is now known as Adelaide University. And basically it was I guess, a different approach to academic publishing in terms of a group of creative writers thinking through issues of the environment and also ecological sort of disaster through creative writing, through writing kind of centered around like keywords in terms of like green ecology, so to speak.
Mm.
Um, and so that was a really interesting project and was sort of a learning experience for me, because I'm not a creative writer by trade, but I am interested in creative writing practice, um, and the kinds of, I guess, the way to explore the sort of environment around us through the interior of the person. So through the sort of thinking and writing and um, reading the work of others and workshopping. And so that was the kind of, I guess, foundation of that group, which was a really nice project to work on.
And you've done quite a lot of collaborative work. I know that you jointly edited a special issue of a journal about translingual, translocal movements and so on. And this is not the traditional hermit-like world of the literary scholar who sits on her own and meditates on grand texts. These articles that have 4 or 5 or 15 authors are much more what we see in the sciences historically. Could you share with us that sort of experience that you've had, not just in the environmental green writing project, but elsewhere as well? What's it like to be in a group of people trying to put something together when you've probably been trained in your doctorate to just sit on your own and get the damn thing done?
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like, you mentioned that this is really a practice that the sciences have adopted in terms of these articles with a large number of authors. And I sort of feel like, well, why not? Why not, creative writers or literary scholars or, historians? Like, why is that not a practice that we can also do? There's not, in my mind, there's not really a reason why we can't. Um, so I like working in groups of people, especially people that I'd published with a few times, because we get to know each other. We're interested in similar things, and the writing just feels really like everybody's on the same wave, We sort of bounce ideas off each other. I think of things um, that I wouldn't have thought of if I wasn't in conversation or collaborating with those people. And so I like the idea of, it's not me sitting in a cramped childhood bedroom writing all these articles that I don't have time to write because I'm teaching focused. Why not sort of expand and think about, these kinds of like multi-vocal papers where you get different perspectives and different experiences of, whatever it is. I do some work on like higher education teaching in those kinds of articles. And so that's always really nice, um, because I learn a lot from my colleagues about what they're trying in their classrooms, but also the literary stuff. Um, I just feel like it's a really nice generative relationship, and the writing comes, it kind of flows a little bit more. And so
Mhm.
I enjoy that aspect of it a lot. And yeah, I feel like there's not really a reason why we as literary scholars can't do that. It's just we've been trained that, single authored publications are the best thing and they're the standard. I don't know if I might sound bad to say it, but I don't know if I'm necessarily interested in, all that. I'd rather just write what I feel will be what is compelling me in the moment.
Mm-hmm. Prof, I have one more question for you, if I may. And once you've answered it, I'd like to give you the opportunity to raise anything you wish, and that could take the form of going over terrain we've already covered where you wish to add something, or it might be something we haven't discussed at all. Does that sound okay as a means of drawing things to a close?
Yeah.
Yeah. So my last question is again touching on something that you mentioned very briefly, which is theoretical questions. Um, where does literary theory, for example, sit right now in literary studies and in your pedagogy?
Good question. I've been thinking about that in a kind of, I don't know, roundabout way in terms of my pedagogy and in terms of maybe going back a bit to this idea of reading cultures. And there's certainly a place, I think, for teaching, what have been the foundational skills of literary studies in terms of close reading and interpretation, um, of the kind of reading where you're looking for clues and symbolism and those kinds of aspects to get at some kind of deeper, meaning in the text. I think there's a place for it. But I'm also interested in where our students can also understand text as more culturally and socially and politically situated. So I'm trying to bring the literary theory in terms of, a set of practices for analyzing text, but also recognizing that that's not the only way to understand literature or um, analyze it or, get to the heart of it. And that
Mhm.
actually there's something to that cultural, social, political aspect of how texts are made and who they're read by and who writes them and in what time and place that I feel like is also really crucial. And so a lot of my work is trying to blend those two things. Um, I don't know how successfully, but trying.
Well, I guess what you're talking about in part is so that people can understand form and style at the same
Yeah.
time as they comprehend social context.
Yeah. That's much better put than what I'd.
Well, I had the benefit of listening to you and then coming out with a glib sentence. Is there anything you'd like to add? As I said, that might take the form of something entirely new to our conversation or revisiting something we've already discussed.
Um, I suppose I mean, and this might be putting you on the spot, so it's okay if not. But I'm always interested in the last thing that you read that really kind of um moved you or struck you, or you thought, wow, that was like a great book or text.
That's a good question. I mean, I've been reading police procedurals by the late British crime novelist Peter Lovesey recently, and they circulate around a rather unlikely anti-hero who is obese, arrogant, difficult, quite unpopular, but also charming. And they involve quite powerful descriptions of his interactions with his superiors, his, in inverted commas, inferiors, his domestic partners, and so on. And they're also quite good in their evocation of certain parts of Britain. So I really like them because, of course, as with, in inverted commas, all genre fiction, um, or as with, say, self-help books or recipe books, they involve a mixture of something that is very familiar. It unfolds in a way that is comfortable, but that has something sufficiently different about it to make it worth finishing. And
Yeah.
The one I'm reading at the moment, which I'm taking a while to get through for other reasons, is about the mystery of a guy falling into one of those huge containers of grain that are on industrial farms and what killed him and why. So,
Right. Interesting. I like what you said about there's something about the kind of genre of fiction. I've been thinking about also like the who done it. And there's
mhm.
something quite, I don't know, something quite nostalgic and also comforting that I find in those kinds of texts as well. Um, and also the texts that kind of play upon that idea of a who done it, which I really like.
No, quite so. And one of the things here is this interplay of repetition and difference. That is
Mm,
really the key to all of genre, I think. And as I say, there's something that you know will happen if you're watching a horror movie, but there's something different there that keeps you with it. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
it doesn't
those
keep
kinds
me
of.
because I get too frightened, but other people can manage it. For me, that kind of fiction is a bit like going on a fun fair ride where you're blasted in and around uh, an apparatus, and I'm just not enjoying it.
Yeah, yeah. I've found, and this is not a good practice, but recently I've been reading a book, and if it's getting a bit, my heart rate's going up, and I
Mm.
don't know what's going to happen. I'll flick to the back to see, what goes on, and then I'm like, okay, that happens, and then I go back, which is spoiling the book for myself and the experience of reading for myself. But sometimes it is nice to know, okay, this will work out for this character, and then I can prepare myself.
Exactly. And I think when there are adaptations of books into television series or films, and you've seen or read one before the other, it can actually be very enriching to see how the new version is generated and what is different from the thing you read or watched. And of course, sometimes looking for the hermeneutic key by rifling your way to the end, as you say. So,
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
not all reading has to be from A to Z. Well, Prof, thank you very, very much. I really enjoy your work and have gained much from reading it and even more from talking to you today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It's been lovely to just chat with you for the last hour or so.